Affirmative action programs are perhaps more controversial today than they have been in decades. Part of this may be due to the fact that recent court cases have cast down a number of affirmative action programs in colleges, universities, and in the workplace. It also may be due to the fact that many people perceive race relations today to be much better than they were in the 60s and the 70s. What we're going to do in this video is take a look at the arguments for and against affirmative action. First, we'll look at arguments in favor of affirmative action, and then we'll look at arguments against affirmative action. The term affirmative action refers to programs instituted in order to ensure fair access to desirable positions in business by historically discriminated against and underrepresented groups. Affirmative action programs were instituted in response to systematic discrimination in the United States. They began with executive orders by John F. Kennedy in 1961 and Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. Non-controversial aspects of affirmative action include targeted recruiting, improvements to educational systems and relief of poverty, and diversity training. However, controversial aspects of these programs include quota systems, in which a business is expected to hire women and minorities eventually to the degree to which they are represented in the larger population. Another aspect that's controversial is separate hiring and admissions tracks for white candidates and non-white candidates, for men and for women. Arguments for affirmative action program often fall into two basic categories, and the first are arguments dealing with historical compensation. Given that many African Americans today are descended from Africans who were brought to America in chains and then forced into servitude, the idea of this argument is that affirmative action programs help to compensate this group of people who have been historically wronged. Most arguments, though, fall into the category of current and the future lack of fairness in the society in which we live. So, for instance, many people are denied positions in business and in education due to active discrimination, and sometimes due to unconscious discrimination, or due to poverty and educational gaps. The reality of discrimination today has been established in a number of different studies. For instance, there was an experiment in which the company ABC sent two candidates looking for jobs. The first was a woman named Julie, and the second was a man named Chris. Julie and Chris had exactly identical qualifications in terms of their educational background and their previous employment history. When Julie went to the first company, she was offered a job answering phones, whereas Chris was offered a managerial position. They sent them to a second company, and a similar thing happened. Julie was hired as a receptionist, and Chris was given an opportunity to be a territory manager. This study and others like it show that unconscious stereotypes about what men and women can do or are best suited to do are still influencing hiring and promotion today. An Urban Institute study sent a number of different candidates with equal qualifications and learned that blacks and Hispanics were offered 50% fewer jobs. In one study, white ex-cons received more callbacks than blacks who had never been to prison. And in a third study, white-sounding names on resumes received 50% more callbacks for interviews than names that were not, so to speak, white-sounding. So given the current lack of fairness in terms of hiring, and also income disparities, which are still great between men and women, and between white workers and non-white workers, the argument is that we clearly still need affirmative action programs in order to make sure that the best qualified people are hired for each position. A third kind of argument for affirmative action is the fact that affirmative action programs promote diversity in the workplace, and diversity is something valuable for everyone. In educational institutions, a more diverse student body and staff and faculty help to give students skills needed in the global marketplace, and helps them learn the material in a deeper way through the impact of discussion with people from different backgrounds. In the business world, it's been proven that teams with diverse backgrounds have unique and creative problem-solving abilities. Also, they're better able to produce and market products that appeal to a wide variety of customers. So, to the degree that diversity is valuable in the business world and in education. Affirmative action programs promote that diversity, and therefore that gives support to the validity of affirmative action programs. The other argument is that affirmative action programs will make sure that the best people are hired. As the ABC experiment and the Urban Institute studies showed, a lot of people are hired not because they're best qualified for a position, but because of their status in terms of gender or race. And so effective affirmative action programs help to ensure that the very best people are hired for the position. Finally, the programs that have been in place for a while have been argued to be quite effective. And when these programs are abolished, we find that the situation rolls back considerably. So for instance, California abolished affirmative action programs in education in 1998, and very quickly there were 61% fewer admits to Berkeley from underrepresented groups and 36% fewer admissions to UCLA. Similar numbers have been found elsewhere, where states have rolled back affirmative action programs in education. There are, of course, a number of arguments against affirmative action as well. Probably the most prevalent argument is that affirmative action programs are a form of discrimination. In this case, reverse discrimination, discrimination against people on the basis of race and gender, only this time it's discrimination primarily against people who are Caucasian and people who are male. There's a real question whether affirmative action programs are constitutional. For instance, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is taken to protect people against discrimination on the basis of non-relevant factors like race or gender. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, and in cases of affirmative action programs, especially those that use quotas or separate hiring tracks, it does seem clear that decisions for hiring and promotion are being made on the basis of race and gender. Another concern with affirmative action programs is that they perpetuate racial and gender consciousness. One of the main purposes of affirmative action programs is that decisions for hiring and promotion are made on the basis of the value of the candidate, not based on racial or gender consciousness. And yet affirmative action programs perpetuate this very situation in which race and gender are concerned at every level, or are considered at every level in the hiring and promotion processes of businesses and educational institutions. There's also a concern that affirmative action programs provoke resentment in the workplace. It may be that the very best candidate for a position was a minority candidate and that person gets hired, but there will be resentment in the workplace because people will think that the candidate was hired on the basis of his or her race, even if she or he is the best qualified person for that position. So there's resentment in the workplace because perhaps someone got a promotion that someone else thought that they deserved, and that person happens to be a person of color or a woman, and people will just assume that they got the job for those reasons and not because of qualifications. So there's a provoking of racial and sexist resentment in the workplace. There's also a concern that affirmative action programs actually stigmatize the very people that they're designed to help, so that minorities and women are seen as a class of individuals who don't have the skills or the talent on their own to be hired for the best positions in the business world. Another argument against affirmative action is that it gives those who receive these benefits a sense of entitlement. In other words, it discourages the hard work that is essential to a successful economy. It's also seen by some to be condescending to women and to minorities because it says to them, you actually cannot be hired unless we give you special privileges. You would not be able to get into this school unless we lowered the standards for you. And that's seen by many women and minorities actually to be an insulting position. Interestingly enough, it is argued against affirmative action that it's economically inefficient, that affirmative action programs result in less qualified people being hired and promoted. Of course, this was also a concern for those arguing for affirmative action programs. Their position is that the less qualified person is often hired or promoted due to him or being white or her being white, or due to gender. And so both sides will argue that that affirmative action programs have a certain impact on economic efficiency that favors their side. The final argument, and this is sort of a catch-all argument, is this: that affirmative action made sense in the 60s and the 70s because of how deeply racist and discriminatory the business world and the educational world was at that time. And so it was a radical sort of medicine for a virulent disease, much as we might use chemotherapy to fight cancer. But as soon as the cancer is in remission, we stop the chemotherapy because of how harmful chemotherapy is to the body. Likewise, people will argue that things have improved dramatically in the business world and in the world of education, and now the reverse discrimination and the other problems that come along with affirmative action are actually much worse than the current disease that's trying to be healed. So these are a number of arguments for and against affirmative action. I do think that a lot of the differences come down to different intuitions about how bad the situation currently is. And one thing we need to keep in mind is that whether we have affirmative action programs or we don't have affirmative action programs, we're still going to have the problem that sometimes less qualified people are being hired and promoted on the basis of race and gender. Without affirmative action programs, this will often happen because of conscious and unconscious forms of discrimination and stereotyping. If we do have affirmative action programs, there will be times when better qualified people from the majority are set aside on the basis of race and gender. What we need to do as we think through these arguments is determine which of these bad solutions is better. We have to balance out intelligently and honestly the advantages and the disadvantages of each of these approaches. Also, something very important to point out is in the next video, we're going to look at best practices in hiring and promotion. These best practices do not rely on a quota system or separate tracks for hiring and promotion. Instead, they are best practices that promote diversity in the workplace without any of the problems of these sorts of controversial aspects of affirmative action programs.